At 10:15 on a Tuesday night in Washington, with less than 2 hours left before 50% tariffs were set to hit $20 billion of Canadian goods, Donald Trump opened Truth Social and posted that he was pausing the entire thing. He said it was based on the fact that Canada and the United States, subject to the finalization of documents, had a deal. 90 minutes. That is how close this confrontation came to detonating in full before it suddenly, almost inexplicably, did not. And when you go back and actually trace what happened inside that final phone call between Mark Carney and Donald Trump earlier that same day, what emerges is not the story of two leaders shaking hands on a finished agreement. It is the story of a Canadian Prime Minister delivering a message blunt enough and firm enough that it changed the president's calculus in the span of a single afternoon. Sources close to the call later described it as essentially 3 words long in substance: "We are ready." A signal that Canada had made its peace with the tariffs landing exactly as scheduled and had already prepared its own retaliation to go with them. That single detail matters more than almost anything else in this entire standoff, because it explains why a president who had spent weeks insisting he did not care whether a deal with Canada ever happened suddenly found himself reaching for a 5-year dead pipeline as a concession with barely 90 minutes left on the clock. If you want to understand exactly what happened inside that final phone call, why Trump blinked when every earlier signal pointed toward the tariffs simply taking effect, and why this specific 90-minute window ended up shaping everything that followed in the weeks after, stay with this one, because the mechanics behind this particular pause reveal far more about the real balance of power here than the headline percentage ever did. If breakdowns like this help you see past the noise, hit subscribe and drop a comment with your take, because this moment deserves a much closer look than it got in the first 24 hours of coverage. Let's rebuild the full sequence, because you need the entire arc to understand why those final 90 minutes carried so much weight. Back in February 2026, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Trump had overstepped his authority when he used emergency economic powers to impose sweeping tariffs on dozens of countries simultaneously, a decision that stripped away his fastest and most flexible trade weapon almost overnight. Legal teams inside the White House needed a replacement that could move just as quickly, and they found one buried in a statute nobody had touched in 77 years. Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, tucked inside the same Smoot-Hawley legislation historians blame for deepening the Great Depression, lets a president impose duties of up to 50% on any country found to be discriminating against American commerce, and it requires nothing else. No investigation from the Trade Representative's Office, no congressional vote, no national security finding. The president signs a proclamation and the clock starts immediately. On July 20th, 2026, Trump signed 3 of them, targeting Canadian motor vehicles, alcoholic beverages, and dairy, citing disputes that had been simmering for well over a year, provincial liquor bans that swept across most of Canada starting in early 2025, and long-standing complaints about Canada's dairy supply management systems. Combined, the 3 proclamations covered close to $20 billion in Canadian goods, spanning roughly 500 separate product lines from hockey sticks and honey to essential oils, cement, plywood, and clothing. The tariffs were scheduled to take effect 30 days later, at 1 minute past midnight Eastern Time on August 19th. For most of that 30-day window, the tone out of Washington stayed defiant. Trump had told reporters earlier in the summer that Canada could simply be a country where there is just a tariff and not really a negotiation. A line that stuck with Canadian officials because it signaled Washington wasn't treating this like a deal in progress. It was treating it like a punishment already decided. Canada's chief trade negotiator Janice Charette and Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc spent the final stretch before the deadline in direct meetings in Washington with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer, working through a specific sticking point over vehicle tariffs, with Canada pushing to bring the existing 25% auto duty down toward 15%, while American negotiators wanted any reduction tied strictly to verified American content inside each vehicle rather than counting broader North American-made parts, which is what Canada was pushing for instead. As Tuesday, August 18th wore on, people close to the talks described officials inside the administration actively downplaying the odds of any last-minute breakthrough. Bloomberg and several other outlets reported that a deal looked unlikely before midnight, and for most of that day, every visible signal pointed toward the 50% tariffs simply taking effect exactly as scheduled, right on time, with no exceptions. Now here's where the story actually turns, because it hinges on 2 phone calls, not 1. Carney and Trump had already spoken once that Monday, and they spoke again earlier on Tuesday afternoon, the second conversation between the 2 leaders in as many days. Carney's office, in its public statement afterward, described the discussion only as ongoing negotiations, offering no further detail about what was actually said. But people familiar with how that call unfolded described a shift in tone that went beyond typical diplomatic back and forth. Canada had spent the preceding days quietly finalizing its own retaliation package, a mirrored set of tariffs ready to be announced the moment the American duties actually took effect, and multiple officials briefed on the substance of the call indicated Carney made clear, directly and without ambiguity, that Canada was fully prepared to let the deadline pass and respond immediately rather than continue negotiating from a position that felt one-sided. That posture, prepared rather than desperate, willing rather than pleading, is precisely what people close to the exchange later summarized as functionally 3 words, "We are ready," a message that removed any lingering assumption in Washington that Canada would simply absorb the tariffs and keep negotiating quietly afterward the way it largely had during earlier rounds of this broader conflict. Think about why that specific signal would matter so much to an administration that had spent weeks projecting total confidence. The entire architecture of Section 338 was built around speed and pressure, a 30-day countdown designed to force concessions before a targeted country had time to organize a coordinated response. If Washington believed Canada was still scrambling, still hoping for relief, still treating the deadline as something to be avoided at nearly any cost, there was no reason to offer anything at all in those final hours. The tariffs would simply land, and Canada would keep negotiating from underneath them, exactly as the law's designers intended. But a Canada that had already finished building its own retaliation, that had already accepted the tariffs might hit and had a mirrored response ready to announce within the same news cycle, represented something entirely different. It meant the deadline pressure Section 338 was engineered to apply had stopped working as leverage, because the party it was supposed to pressure had already priced in the worst-case outcome and moved past the fear of it. That is an uncomfortable realization for any negotiator to arrive at, with less than 2 hours remaining. And it appears to be exactly what happened inside the White House that Tuesday evening. What came next, in the final 90 minutes before midnight, is the part that actually made headlines, even though it wasn't the real story. Trump posted that he was pausing the 50% tariffs, explicitly tying the decision to the fact that a deal was in place pending finalization of documents. And then he added a detail that told you exactly which lever had actually moved him, at least on the surface. He referenced Keystone XL by name, suggesting the pipeline, dead since 2021 when the previous administration revoked its permit, might be awoken from the grave. That pipeline was originally proposed back in 2008, designed to carry roughly 830,000 barrels of crude oil daily from Alberta down into Nebraska. Trump had approved it during his first term. For 5 years, it sat as a symbol more than an active piece of infrastructure, a political talking point rather than a construction site. And now, in the final minutes before a 50% tariff was supposed to hit $20 billion of Canadian trade, it was suddenly back in the conversation, dangled specifically to keep the deadline from arriving on schedule. A professor of international business at a leading Canadian business school offered a sharp read on why Keystone XL specifically became the face-saving concession in that final window. He argued the inclusion of the pipeline in these negotiations wasn't really about the oil transport benefits at all, since energy was never even part of the Section 338 tariffs to begin with. It was about ego, about the fact that Biden was the one who killed the project, and reviving it pushed exactly the kind of symbolic button that mattered most to the man across the table. In other words, Canada didn't need to offer a genuine economic concession to make Washington pause in those final 90 minutes. It needed to offer something that felt like a personal win for the president. On a topic that cost Ottawa essentially nothing, it was actually planning to give up, layered on top of a private signal that Canada had already stopped fearing the deadline itself. That combination, a symbolic gesture paired with a credible willingness to walk away, is what actually produced the pause, not a finished agreement, and certainly not the kind of capitulation the original 30-day countdown was designed to extract. Carney's own public statement, released about an hour after Trump's post, reflected that reality with striking precision. He did not speak of a finished deal. He did not list concessions. He said simply that substantial progress had been made, although important work remained to be done, and that while those talks continued, Canada remained focused on building a stronger, more independent, and more competitive economy at home, regardless of the outcome. That is not the language of a leader celebrating a win. It is the language of someone who understands the clock got reset, not switched off, and who wanted Canadians to hear that distinction clearly rather than assume the confrontation had ended. The same international business professor who flagged the ego angle behind Keystone XL put the risk in blunt terms too, saying the real test would be whether an actual deal materialized within the new 72-hour window, or whether both sides ended up right back where they started in what he called a Groundhog Day moment. Here's the part that actually favors Canada more than the surface headline suggested that night, and it is worth sitting with the underlying numbers for a moment. Roughly 70% of everything Canada exports goes to the United States, while only about 30% of American exports flow the other direction into Canada. On paper, That asymmetry looks like exactly the kind of leverage Washington counted on when it built this entire strategy. The assumption that Canada simply could not afford to walk away from its largest customer, regardless of how aggressive the tariff terms became. And yet, despite holding that structural advantage on paper, it was the American president who moved first in those final 90 minutes, who extended the deadline, who dangled a symbolic concession, and who did it all with less than 2 hours left before his own self-imposed threat was due to take effect. If the leverage genuinely sat entirely on one side, the negotiation would have simply run out the clock and the tariffs would have started exactly as scheduled, full stop, no drama, no pipeline mentions, no late-night Truth Social post, walking back a threat that had been building for a full month. Instead, the country holding the supposedly weaker hand watched its trading partner pause its own ultimatum voluntarily, in public, in the final 90 minutes, which is about as clear a signal as you can get that the pressure Washington was applying had not produced the fear-driven capitulation it was designed to produce. Look at what Canada was actually dealing with domestically in the days leading into that Tuesday call, because the political terrain inside the country made any quiet, low-key concession from Ottawa almost impossible in the first place. And that context helps explain why Carney's message in that final call carried the weight it apparently did. 8 of Canada's 10 provinces had been blocking sales of American alcoholic beverages since early the previous year, a coordinated response to earlier rounds of tariffs. And that policy stayed firmly in place right up through this final stretch of negotiations, because provincial leaders showed little appetite for reversing it under pressure. Public opinion made backing down even harder to justify politically. A poll conducted in July found that 69% of Canadians said they were unlikely to buy American alcohol again, even if the bans were formally lifted. And separate polling released earlier in August showed nearly half of Canadians held an unfavorable view of Americans overall. A political science lecturer at a major Canadian university described a strong current of defiance running through the public mood at the time, noting that while the economic damage from new tariffs would be significant in specific sectors, and Canadians understood that clearly, there was also a real sense of national pride that Carney and the provincial premiers had to weigh carefully, because the majority of the public wanted their sovereignty defended and had little interest in trade peace bought at any price. That is the domestic environment Carney was negotiating inside of during that Tuesday call. A public that would have punished him politically for folding too easily, which meant the message he delivered to Trump had to look credible rather than performative. And everything about how Washington responded in the following 90 minutes suggests it read as exactly that. Step back and look at the broader arc of what this specific moment reveals about how modern trade standoffs actually get decided, because the pattern here is worth sitting with carefully. Washington built a weapon specifically for speed, deliberately choosing a statute that skipped nearly every procedural safeguard other tariff tools require, precisely so it could apply maximum pressure inside a compressed 30-day window. That same rush, though, meant the administration had less time to build a durable, quiet coalition of support behind the threat before the deadline actually arrived. And it meant Washington's negotiators walked into that final Tuesday phone call without a clear read on just how far Canada had already moved past the fear the deadline was supposed to instill. Industry voices on the American side had already been raising concerns for weeks about a 50% duty applying to goods that had never before lost their USMCA protections, a detail multiple trade analysts flagged as the specific feature that made this round different from every earlier tariff action against Canada. Meanwhile, on the Canadian side, a diversification strategy already running in the background for well over a year, new trade agreements signed with Ecuador and the United Arab Emirates, an enhanced relationship with the European Union, active negotiations across Southeast Asia and India gave Ottawa's negotiators genuine room to hold their ground without panicking as the clock ticked down toward midnight. None of that required a single loud public threat of retaliation from Canada in the weeks beforehand. It required patience, a refusal to make the first visible move, and enough political discipline to let Washington's own deadline pressure quietly build against itself instead, right up until the moment a private phone call made that shift impossible to ignore. There's also a legal dimension sitting underneath this entire confrontation that almost certainly factored into how confident Carney could afford to sound in that final call. Section 338 predates the modern international trade framework entirely, and legal scholars have argued the provision was effectively superseded by newer trade statutes passed in 1962 and 1974, the same argument that helped sink Trump's earlier emergency tariff authority in front of the Supreme Court back in February. Canada had already signaled it intended to pursue parallel legal challenges through the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement process and through existing trade agreement mechanisms, meaning that even if the tariffs landed exactly on schedule that Tuesday night, the underlying legal foundation beneath them remained genuinely contestable in court. That possibility gave Canadian negotiators one more reason to sound unshaken during that final call, rather than scrambling for a face-saving compromise purely to avoid the deadline. because time spent litigating wasn't just a defensive fallback, it was an active source of leverage that made the threat of the tariffs landing feel less existential than Washington likely assumed it would. Consider also what the tariffs actually would have hit if that Tuesday night pause had never happened, because the breadth of the target list explains why the pressure to find some kind of resolution was building from more directions than just Ottawa's side of the table. The proclamations covered close to $20 billion in trade spanning electronics, industrial machinery, furniture, dairy products, and wine, alongside smaller but symbolically loaded categories like hockey equipment. American importers of those goods were staring down a 50% cost increase overnight, stacked on top of whatever duties already applied, with no formal exclusion process available the way there is under other tariff authorities like Section 301 or Section 232. That absence of an appeals mechanism meant businesses on the American side had no formal channel to petition for relief once the tariffs actually took effect, which raised the stakes of finding a pause before midnight rather than after. Every hour that passed without resolution pushed American importers closer to a cost shock with genuinely no off-ramp built into the law itself. And that reality applied its own quiet pressure on Washington's side of the table well before Carney's Tuesday afternoon message ever reached the White House. The 3-day pause that emerged from those final 90 minutes was never going to be a permanent resolution on its own, and everyone involved understood that the moment the announcement landed. It bought both governments a window to finalize whatever framework had actually been discussed, covering vehicle tariffs, the dairy dispute, and the alcohol restrictions that provinces had kept in place for well over a year. What happened in the days that followed showed just how fragile that window really was. Talks continued through Wednesday and Thursday, with Canada's trade minister telling reporters the two sides were very close to an agreement, and provincial premiers agreeing as a gesture of good faith to put American alcohol back on store shelves. But by Friday, the entire framework collapsed within a matter of hours, with Carney's office describing last-minute changes to Washington's proposed terms as unfair and uneconomic. And the 50% tariffs ultimately took effect anyway at 12:01 that following Saturday morning, followed almost immediately by Canada's own dollar-for-dollar retaliation. That later collapse doesn't erase what happened during those first 90 minutes, though. If anything, it reinforces exactly how real Canada's readiness to retaliate actually was that Tuesday night, because when the framework did eventually fall apart days later, Canada didn't scramble to build a response from scratch. It executed the same posture it had signaled privately all along, prepared, unhesitant, and unwilling to accept terms it judged as structurally unfavorable, regardless of the deadline pressure attached to them. There's a historical echo worth remembering here, too, because Section 338 comes from the same 1930 legislative package, widely blamed for deepening the Great Depression, a law that triggered a wave of global retaliation so severe it helped collapse international trade by roughly 65% over the following 4 years. With American farmers, the very constituency that legislation was originally designed to protect, ending up among its biggest casualties as other nations fired back with tariffs of their own. Nearly a century later, watching a dormant piece of that same statute get reactivated, and watching the targeted country respond not with panic in the final hours, but with a calm, prepared signal that it had already accepted the worst-case outcome, follows a very different pattern than the original 1930 episode, where retaliation escalated chaotically and reactively rather than being quietly assembled in advance. That difference matters because it suggests Canada's negotiators had studied exactly how deadline-driven pressure campaigns tend to unravel once the targeted party stops behaving like a party still hoping to be spared. Where this entire episode leaves things now is genuinely instructive for understanding everything that has happened since. Those 90 minutes on August 18th were never the end of this standoff, but they were the moment that revealed its actual shape. A law built for speed and maximum pressure ran directly into a government that had quietly finished preparing its own response well before the deadline arrived, and the deadline itself, rather than forcing capitulation, ended up forcing the party that set it to blink first, however briefly. Whatever happened in the days and weeks that followed, the collapsed deal, the retaliatory tariffs, the increasingly blunt public language from both sides, all of it traces back to that single Tuesday afternoon phone call, where a message reportedly distilled to just a few words ended up mattering more than 30 days of formal proclamations and legal maneuvering combined. That is the part of this story worth remembering longest, not the specific tariff percentage or the pipeline that got mentioned as a sweetener, but the fact that when a government stops fearing a deadline and starts preparing for it instead, the entire calculation behind that deadline changes, regardless of how much leverage the other side appeared to hold on paper. If this breakdown helped you understand what actually happened behind those final 90 minutes, hit that like button, drop a comment with your read on what you think Carney actually said on that call, and subscribe so you catch the next update in this ongoing standoff, because based on everything that has unfolded since that Tuesday night, this story is far from finished.